Sacred plants, human voices, timeless truths. Welcome to Entheocast, where we explore sacred experience from the roots of the earth to the heights of the soul. Each week, we step into the inner temple through personal accounts of entheogenic journeys, from psilocybin to cannabis to ayahuasca and beyond, to tell the story of divinity at the edge of a leaf. Thank you all for joining me today on our first episode. Before we begin our full exploration of the spiritual dimensions revealed through entheogenic plants, and going into specific experiences and personal accounts people have shared of their experiences with these divine realms, I thought it would be a good idea to make a quick introductory episode to really make clear what this series is all about. If I had to state in a sentence what makes this podcast unique in the sea of other psychedelic shows, and there are many, I would say we explore the entheogenic plants on the entheogenic plant's own terms. If I had to sum it up in a word, I would say religion. Now, I can feel some of you are following, and some of you may be confused, but this confusion should dissolve rather effortlessly. You see, it has long been noted by both shaman and scientist alike that the relationship between humans and these entheogenic plants have existed for millennia upon millennia. Specifically, and more or less exclusively, in a religious setting. Now, the word religion sparks a very strong reaction in people, and I need to clear something up real quick. If you're currently a member of a religion, then that reaction is going to be something between neutral and positive, most likely. If you do not consider yourself religious or consider yourself an agnostic or an atheist, you probably recoil a bit when that word reaches your ears. You even hear the term among those who aren't of the atheistic crowd, at least, who say things like, I'm spiritual, but not religious. And we all, for the most part, immediately understand what someone who says that means. Because if you live in the United States, at least, we live in, effectively, a religious monoculture. In other words, when people say, I'm spiritual but not religious, they're more accurately saying, I'm spiritual, but I don't believe in the classical and generic Christian church doctrine, Protestant or Catholic. And if they wanted to just be totally accurate in their wording of things, they would probably say, I am religious, but I don't believe in the classical, generic Christian church doctrine, Protestant or Catholic. And this would apply not just for Christian doctrine, but for any of the Abrahamic doctrines that are so common and really rooted into our culture. You see, the way popular culture seems to use the word religion, and the actual dictionary and, much more importantly, legal definition of the word, is very, very different. In popular culture, among a lot of people, but especially the more evangelical of Christians and, amusingly, hardcore atheists alike, there is a conception that religion must include and be centered around a specific deity, that there must be a hierarchical structure, that their adherents must prostrate themselves before the pulpit, and on and on and on. But basically, it's got to look something like the modern Protestant or Catholic Church in most structural ways, both in human organization and beliefs regarding the divine. But this conception of the word religion is, in fact, the result of ignorance. Let's start with the dictionary definition of the word, which I'm going to say right off the bat, I don't necessarily think is all that important, but it's a good starting point before going into the legal definition. So, the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines religion as a personal set or institutionalized system of religious attitudes, beliefs, and practices. Well, that's nice, but it kind of begs the question, what's the definition of religious attitudes? Thankfully, they've got a definition for that too. The definition of the word religious, according to Merriam-Webster, is relating to or manifesting faithful devotion to an acknowledged ultimate reality or deity. I could go into the dictionary's other definitions of religion, but it really isn't necessary. Already, these definitions are quite a bit more broad than you'd expect. It explicitly states that religion can be both an institutionalized system or a personal set of religious attitudes, beliefs, and practices. So you don't need an institution to be a part of a religion. And in the definition of the word religious, it specifies explicitly that we're talking about deity and or an ultimate reality. I think that would be a little surprising to most people. It certainly clears some things up. Because already, if we were to go off of this definition, most, if not practically all, of those people who say, I'm spiritual but not religious, if we're going to be talking literally, they are religious. They practice a religion. They may not call it that, but by all reasonable accounts, that's what it is. They are practicing their religion. But again, the dictionary definition is not always the legal definition, and that's where things can get tricky. However, in the case of the legal definition of religion at least, that is certainly not the case. The First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States of America guarantees the right and freedom of religion. It's quite clear about that. But what's interesting, though, is that there's no single clear statute in U.S. federal law that authoritatively defines religion. In fact, the legal definition, as things often go in these areas, comes down to case law. In the 1965 case of United States v. Seeger, the court ruled that, and I quote, "A religion, in legal terms, includes a sincere and meaningful belief which occupies a place in the life of its possessor parallel to that filled by the orthodox belief in God." And this quite intelligent and broad, notably, definition of religion was strengthened in the Welsh v. United States case of 1970, in which it was stated that religion can be a deeply held moral or ethical belief system, even without belief in a traditional deity, as long as it plays a comparable role in a person's life. And more or less, this seems to be the definition of religion, legally speaking. Now, I laid all of this out because, like I said, I know that there is a sizable group of people who start running for the hills when the word religion is used. And there's a large group of people who would probably want to go to the mat arguing with me that psychedelics are not religious in nature. And in fact, they have nothing to do with religion. But at the end of the day, and in almost every way, whether we're talking historically, phenomenologically, sociologically, anthropologically, or anything else, the entheogenic plants cannot be separated from their reality to divinity. The most ground level, primal, primitive, you could say, an intuitive way that these plants have been used is for direct communion and connection with the divine. You could even say I'm talking about God. Though, just like someone's mental conception of the definition of the word religion, one's particular idea of God, what they even mean by that word, will be their own. Many see God as an anthropomorphic entity. That's kind of the classical understanding to a lot of modern American Christians, at least. Many see the anthropomorphic description as more of an allegory or analogy. Many see God as the prime consciousness that gave birth to this universe and everything in it. Some see God as everything in everything. Some people even think they are God in a very narrow and solipsistic way. And there are many other varieties in which one may put conception to the word God. But regardless of your particular framework, most people of faith, regardless of their specific faith, will say of God that he, she, or it is the purest of the pure, the most powerful of the powerful, the most loving of the loving, the prime source from which we all have come, and that the point of this life we share together is to reach divine union with God. Now, again, this has its linguistic complications. There are schools of Buddhism, for example, just one I could give, who don't consider the concept of divinity in terms of the traditional God word, and maybe even struggle with the concept of divinity itself, depending on the school. However, I've come to the conclusion myself, and I think anyone else looking into these topics will come to a very similar conclusion, that even when you find a pocket of religion that claims to not believe in God, one of two things will be true. Either they are not really religious at all, as is the case with many of these so-called secular spirituality people, so that can be weeded out pretty easily. Or, in the case of certain schools of Buddhism, for example, of which this could be said, it seems to come down to the wish to reunite with the most impersonal aspect of divinity, the aspect of divinity, you could say, that is most removed from anything even remotely of this world, or of what would be familiar to it, including the experience of relation to another. In a sense, they are looking to connect with what is behind God. Thus, in striving for reconnection to this abstract divinity, a shunning of all personal relations to divinity is made. This takes the form of constantly reorienting your recognition of all outside entities and beings as one and the same with yourself. So, for example, someone of these schools of Buddhism may encounter an experience in which they feel they interacted with what another may call God. But then they remind themselves that this is in fact just them, that if anything, they are God, that all they have done is connect to a larger version of themselves. Period. End of the story. And this is all fine and well, but if you ask the same person how they see themselves in relation to, for example, a great oak tree, the same person will very well tell you that the very same thing true of this God is true of this tree. That is, that they, the Buddhist practitioner, and this tree are in fact one and the same, and any conception of division is just an aspect of this illusion of this world. Ask further still how this person sees themselves in relation to yourself, and they will tell you ever still the exact same thing, that you are in fact them, and they are in fact you. This is the classic high-level mystic philosophy of non-dualism, and there is certainly nothing wrong with that. But you see, it is not so much that these schools of Buddhism deny the existence, or rather do not believe in God or gods. It is simply that they devalue the recognition of independent beings. Therefore, God does not exist to them in the exact same way that you do not exist to them, and that they don't even exist to themselves. I don't want anyone to misunderstand me here in thinking I am implying that these schools of Buddhism are deluded or wrong, necessarily. But it is certainly a very specified religious practice that requires the specific devaluing of relationship I've described. And I also understand that the wider Buddhist religion outside of very specific schools openly recognize gods and higher forms of divinity and beings as plainly as your average Christian would. In fact, much more plainly than the average Christian would. I believe one must connect with the divine on the divine's own terms, and this will arise different ways for different people. So in no way do I believe that people who may fall into the category I just described are wrong in the strict sense, or that they need to be corrected or shown the light or whatever. I think everyone is on their own spiritual path, and as long as you've found your own connection to divinity, it would be very immature of me to try to steer someone away from what works for them. I laid out the example of the, you could say, extreme non-dualist Buddhist to show that even in paths such as that one, God is still easily found by simply tweaking your framing of the experience. In a way, I might add, that is in fact more intuitive and easier than the brute forcing of non-dual perception onto every relational experience one encounters in this life. But more importantly, and a more broad way of putting it, it's about noticing how, if one is simply to relate to the religious experience, and the sacramental use of entheogenic plants on their own terms is no exception, relationship is virtually inevitable. The experience of having a relational experience is virtually guaranteed to occur. And while shifting perspective so that relationship is not felt is possible, it is not the default, certainly not for most people, and it's certainly not natural. And usually, it is not even successful. Most denial of relational experience occurs after the relational experience has occurred. Much has been said about the entheogenic plants and fungi, and there are really dozens upon dozens upon dozens, and maybe that's a radical understatement, of books and podcasts and YouTube channels around the topic of these plants in one shape or form. However, over the many years I've been reading, watching, and listening, scouring the web for sources of information and media on this incredibly important topic, I found one angle on the topic quite lacking in coverage. At least in the most direct sense, it's lacking coverage. In fact, I believe it is the biggest and most important angle to this topic, to the point I'm not even sure you could call it an angle, as it's simply what entheogens are at the end of the day. You see, if you're looking for psychedelic media, you'll find countless podcasts of people describing its usefulness and their experiences with it in the context of mental health treatment. You'll find videos of jocular bros talking about how wild and crazy and weird the experience with it was, giggling about it like it's some joke, which is quite frankly, always a bit nauseating to see. You'll find people talking about it from a neuroscientific point of view, from a rather dry phenomenological point of view, just talking about sensations and visual patterns in that disconnected, antiseptic sort of way. A modern historical point of view, perhaps an ethnographical point of view. Tips and suggestions for those looking to embark on an experience. But in all of my research into this topic, the one perspective that is most lacking in representation, and the topic that incurs by far the most ridicule, degradation, and insults when it is the topic of entheogenic plants and fungi in their original relational context with humans. That is to say, the spiritual/religious context. And I'm talking in a direct way. The closest thing that you'll find is that there do exist people from indigenous communities whose people have been engaged with these religious sacraments unbroken for time unknown, who will go out and speak about their religious use. And that is just fantastic. But particularly in the culture of the last decade or so, although it's definitely been the case longer than that, the native people's efforts to talk about and share the religious and spiritual beauty of their sacraments to the world has largely seen a rather ironic reaction. Namely, that when people see an indigenous-looking person talking about what they perceive as a specifically indigenous form of worship, the immediate reaction among many non-indigenous Westerners is to say, "Wow, how fascinating." And then, move along to the talk with an LSD psychotherapist, or at most, take an anthropological interest in documenting their rituals. But very rarely do you see, in a confident and unshamed manner, someone openly proclaim the religious utility of entheogenic plants and fungi who is not genetically indigenous, or who is not talking about it from some kind of outside anthropological point of view. People will talk about it like it's an artifact in a museum, but as far as actually being engaged with these entheogens as the religious sacraments that they are, there's a major degree of separation in most people between that and themselves. There is a virus of the mind that has made people believe they are not worthy of God. That they, due to the color of their skin or the genes in their cells, the culture they grew up in, that they do not qualify for proper union with the divine. I find this boundary-erecting perspective truly acidic to the concept of spirituality/religion, and therefore to the very nature of the entheogens themselves. In no right mind should anyone ever bar themselves from the gates of heaven due to the thought that their genetic heritage may not allow them. This is sick behavior, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. As another piece of evidence of this problem, I offer you to think about all of the experiences you have heard of a person going down to the Amazon rainforest for a series of ayahuasca sessions. Obviously, in these scenarios, a person is literally going to an indigenous community among the religious leaders and shamans who work with and understand the plant more than anyone. And what do they talk about usually? How do they describe their experience? What, generally speaking, of course, is the prime usefulness or takeaway one will have in regards to the entheogenic plants? In my experience, people who have subjected themselves to the full religious experience of going down to the indigenous community and experiencing their own personal sacraments tend to take everything away from the experience except the spiritual connotations. They'll talk about how beautiful life is. They'll describe its aesthetic beauty. They'll proclaim the necessity of protecting this earth and its nature. They'll sing of the power the entheogen holds as a cure for mental health crises. They'll even make reference to God. But I'd say 49 times out of 50, if not 99 times out of 100, the actual aspect of the religious experience they participated in will go either basically unmentioned, just like a trivial mention, or it will disappear from their minds and they will almost become embarrassed by it within a very short time after the experience has ended. We're talking hours to days. And, some of these people will go back and forth from the Amazon, undergoing these same rituals over and over again. And someone could have 200 ayahuasca sessions with a trained indigenous religious shaman and still completely ignore what the indigenous people themselves say is the whole point of these plants. That is, to connect yourself with divinity, to open yourself up to the layers of the divine. In more Western language, to find union with God. And though I don't necessarily feel I have to state this explicitly, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here. I do not, in any way, think it is wrong or immoral for someone to seek out psychedelics in the treatment of their own mental or perhaps even physical health. The right to health is the right to happiness, and I don't know how I or anyone could rightfully deny someone their own health. But there is so much info out there on the uses of entheogenic plants have in the treatment of mental health conditions, and I just don't think there's enough understanding of these plants on their own terms. And in fact, I don't think many people consider the possibility that these plants may even be healing because of their religious power. After all, no one's ever said you cannot find both healing and religion in the same place. In fact, most people turn to religion and church when they find themselves in a health crisis, whether the crisis be physical, or mental, or emotional. And this makes perfect, inseparable sense. For if divinity is the prime fact of this life, if we are living in spiritual realities 24/7, whether we consciously recognize this or not, then asking Jesus Christ to heal you at Sunday service makes perfect sense, or asking God directly via prayer at your own bedside. Or, depending on your religious tradition, asking for healing through the divine messenger of an entheogenic plant or fungi. The problem, as I see it, can be related with a simple analogy. The deficiency I see in this discourse and community around entheogenic plants and fungi is the same deficiency one would see in someone who only identifies as an evangelical Christian or Methodist Christian or whatever, and only prays or fulfills other aspects of this faith when they are sick, when they are in desperate need of a cure. Imagine for a moment if one identified as an atheist and went about their life in complete separation from religion of any kind. Then suddenly they are diagnosed with a cancerous tumor, and the next day they're knelt at the pew of their childhood church praying for health and healing and forgiveness of sins and anything else that'll get the healing going. And wouldn't you know it, this guy actually gets healed. It works. And so, of course, as anyone would expect, he immediately says, "Fantastic," throws his Bible in the trash, and goes back to being a self-identified atheist. He'll speak of health, of course, but never again will he utter the words religion in a positive context. Okay, would this seem to make sense to anyone? You would think the religious healing he encountered would bolster his understanding, as he has found the perfect evidence himself, the evidence of his eyes and ears, to quote Orwell, his own personal experience. And yet he does the opposite. He drops all spiritual gobbledygook, as he has always put it, and goes about his life no more religious than he was before. And this, my friends, is what I see as the case for many, if not most, of these mental health-focused Westerners who go down to drink ayahuasca or take part in many of the other entheogenic religious rituals. During the entheogenic experience, with the intention of healing held heavy in their heart, they will almost certainly experience the divine and see their connection to it. But when they have been healed, or at least greatly helped, and when that veil between our material reality and the finer spiritual dimensions that are just as present but usually invisible begin to close up once again, they drop the actual content, context, and implications of the entheogenic experience completely. They devalue the spiritual experience of connection to divinity itself, many going as far as to adamantly claim there is, in fact, nothing spiritual about the entheogenic experience at all, and insist on focusing solely on its utility for the curing of mental illness. Like I have already said, this is fine if this is what you want. People are on their own paths, and if one is finding benefit from these religious sacraments outside of a religious context, I'm certainly not going to wage a war around all of this. But I must speak out, and I must speak the truth. And I want to quickly just reiterate again, I can imagine someone, in fact, there could be a large group of people could be listening to this podcast and think that I'm trying to say that there's basically nothing about the spiritual, genuine religious uses of entheogenic plants and fungi out there. And you're probably listening and saying to yourself, hey, I'm not like what he's describing. Like, I use these things spiritually. I totally understand that there is a good chunk of people out there who understand what these things really are. And if you're one of these people, I think that is absolutely fantastic. And I encourage you to speak out and I encourage you to talk about it, because in the popular culture, the religious aspect of entheogens is largely shoved into a outsider, anthropological, sophisticated scientist looking in at primitive cultures, ritual type of a situation, where the reality is that these things are religious sacraments, and they are not bound by any culture, race, genetic code, or anything. These are sacraments of God for humanity, period. So, in this podcast, we'll be exploring what I believe is the actual default identity of entheogenic plants and fungi, which is as a powerful element of religious worship, usually the element of religious worship, to those who find themselves spiritually engaged with these sacraments. Not only are these plants and fungi religious in nature, it is impossible to reasonably separate them from their inherent religious nature, and we will be exploring this fact and supporting it and giving examples and evidence and personal stories throughout this podcast. If you happen to be a skeptic listening to this, then I simply encourage you to keep an open mind and listen to the podcast. Perhaps your mind won't be changed, but I feel quite confident it will, to one degree or another. Because when you start digging into the details and really start looking at both the described nature of religion and the psychedelic experience side by side, one finds that the debate isn't so much a debate as much as it is a linguistic shell game. If one is capable of adhering to a definition of religion and spirituality that applies reasonably to all religions and not just a specific sect of a sect, such as those who wish to define religion only insofar as it looks like Calvinism, or those who do the same but for the Roman Catholic Church, or for the LDS Church, or for the various branches of Orthodox Christianity, or any other religion, the entheogenic plants will be forced into recognition as supreme religious sacraments. So, I invite you to come on this journey with me. If you accept, I'd appreciate it if you would follow the podcast or subscribe, so you'll be among the first to see the official first episode, where we really start getting into the details when it comes out. I look forward to talking to you again soon, and keep listening inward, keep growing outward, and remember, the divine speaks through the world and through you. This is Entheocast, and we'll talk very soon.